On his return to France, the Duc de Vicence-Caulaincourt was appointed Minister of Exterior Relations, replacing the Duc de Bassano-Marais, who was unjustly supposed to have been sacrificed to the intrigues of the peace party. The real reason for the selection of the Duc de Vicence was the hope that the favor which this minister had enjoyed with the Emperor Alexander during his mission to St. Petersburg would place him in a position to render useful services and fitted him more than anybody else to bring affairs to a happy termination. Monsieur de Bassano returned to the Ministry of State Secretaryship. Count de Roux passed to the Ministry of War Administration, which had been left vacant by the retirement of Count Le Couet de Cessac. The Emperor, in appointing a successor to this honest and rigid administrator, endowed with the same qualities, considered Monsieur de Roux more accustomed to the prompt dispatch of business and the details of so vast an administration. The Duc de Massa Renier, who needed rest on account of his bad state of health, ceded the Ministry of Justice, definitely to Count Molay, who had been directing it in his place since the preceding month of June. His name, one of the most illustrious in the magistracy, and his familiarity with hard work, which proved by a book of real value which Monsieur Molay had published at the age of 25, had attracted the Emperor's attention. The young author of Essais de morale et de politique, Essays of Morals and Politics, was included in the first list of auditors created in 1806 and was rapidly promoted to the post of prefect, counselor of state, and director general of the Department of Bridges and Highways. Napoleon liked Monsieur Molay very much and treated him with a kindness which the latter returned with great devotion. On his return from the island of Elba, the Emperor proposed the Ministry of Exterior Relations and then the Ministry of the Interior to Monsieur Molay, which the former Grand Judge refused to accept, believing himself, it is said, bound by the oath which he had taken to the reestablished monarchy. Although personally, I must regret that Monsieur Molay refused the Emperor the assistance of his talents under such grave circumstances. His scruples in any case are worthy of praise rather than of blame. What cannot be denied to Count Molay is a loyal heart and a distinguished intelligence. He showed great wisdom and no ordinary capacity in the administration of business. His honorable character won for him general esteem and respect. The Emperor opened the legislative session on December 19, 1813. His words to the representatives of the nation were noble and touching. The deputies appointed a committee to draw up the address. The answer of the legislative body was bound to have great weight not only on public opinion, but also on the intentions of the Allies. Napoleon, trusting to the patriotic feelings of the majority of this assembly, wished the committee to be composed of men not dependent on the government. And as a matter of fact, men who were strangers to public functions were chosen, men devoted to the study of literature and laws, but who thought less of serving the interests of the country than of parading their independence. The royalists' way of thinking even found echoes amongst them. The deputies who composed this committee were Messieurs Launay, barrister at Bordeaux, Renoir, author of the tragedy Le Templier, the Templars, Gallois, a former tribune, Flaujourgues, a barrister at Toulouse, and Men de Burin, a former garde du corps, a man who was generally respected but who did not understand the situation in which France and the Emperor were placed at that time. Monsieur Gallois drew up a report. Napoleon had accused Monsieur Launay of having been in secret intelligence with the English government with a view of restoring the Bourbons. I know that he had very strong suspicions in the matter. Monsieur Launay himself undertook to justify the accusation brought against him. Monsieur Renoir attracted attention to himself by his violence. His tragedy called Les Etats du Blois, the States of Blois, which had been performed in 1810 at the Theater of St. Cloud, and also his tragedy, Les Templiers, the Templars, had been severely judged by the Emperor. The poet's self-esteem is very touchy. Might not one think that Monsieur Renoir was influenced in this matter by his recollection of the way in which Napoleon had criticized his plays? Instead of calling upon the nation to unite itself closely to its chief, the commission, whilst agreeing that an energetic defense was necessary to obtain peace, complained about the oppression of the people, asked for guarantees against arbitrary power, and demanded the execution of laws favorable to liberty and to the free exercise of political rights. These remonstrances, which would have been admissible at any other time, but which were most untimely then, constituted a bill of indictment against a man in whose power alone it lay to save the state. They discredited him in the eyes of Europe and of the nation which had to be called to arms to defend an invaded territory. In the same way, the Greeks were busy with religious squabbles when the battering ram of Mahomet II was already dashing against the doors of Constantinople. The legislative body adopted the report of the committee by a large majority. A proof of this report having been carried to the emperor, he summoned a privy council, at the instance of which the violent measure of dissolving the legislative body was adopted. Since there was no means of coming to an understanding, this measure imposed itself. The legislative body, instead of being a lever, became a club in the hands of the intriguing ringleaders. In my audiences in the evening with the emperor, rendered deeply anxious by the spirit of opposition which took advantage of his adversity to crush him at the very time when he stood in need of help, he used to ask me what the empress thought of this struggle so new for this princess, and the measure which had been its consequence. I must mention that I used to see the emperor with the same intimacy as in the past. I found him careworn, although he did his best to master his anxiety. But in public, his face was calm and reassured. In our conversations, he used to complain of feeling tired of war and of not being able to endure horse exercise anymore. He reproached me in jest with having fine times, whilst he painfully dragged his plow. Such was his expression. In one word, he felt that he was no longer happy. One could not help looking at him with melancholy interest and seeing Napoleon unhappy. My veneration for him increased. The enemy crossed the Rhine on the last day of 1813. The Allied armies had hesitated a long while. The prestige of glory still covered our frontiers, besides a divergence of the political interests of the various powers divided them on the great question of an invasion of France. The promptings and the encouragements of conspirators in the interior of the country made them waver without deciding them. What at last put a stop to their hesitations was an offer which was made to them of a passage through Switzerland. The oligarchical party in Bern, which before the act of mediation had asked for Austria's intervention in the interior affairs of Switzerland, was raising its head again. This party, encouraged by Baron Sempt de Pilsach, who was a turncoat from the Saxon military service, proposed to Prince Schwarzenberg, who had become commander-in-chief of the Allied armies, to surrender him the way through the valleys. Switzerland, heedless of her independence and forgetting the benefits which she had derived from the act of mediation, allowed her neutrality to be violated, a neutrality the inviolability of which the Diet had only just solemnly proclaimed. She thus opened the way to the Allied forces, who were in this way able to cross our frontiers without hindrance, for France, reposing too great confidence in the good faith of Switzerland, had neglected to fortify them on that side. 5 days later, after the adjournment of the Legislative Council, January 4th, 1814, the Emperor sent the Duc de Vicence to the headquarters of the Allies with instructions which have been made public and which show Napoleon's desire for peace. It was said in these instructions that if fortune betrayed him, his mind was made up, that he did not care for the throne, and that he would leave it rather than submit to shameful conditions. The Duc de Vicence, who was detained a fortnight at Luneville, at last obtained an invitation to proceed to Châtillon, where Lord Castlereagh had just arrived. A sham congress was to be assembled there at the same time that the armies of the enemy were pursuing their march onward in the French provinces. The Empress Marie-Louise kept up a vigorous correspondence with her father. She used to receive from him nothing but assurances of interest and repeated promises that he would never sacrifice whatever might happen, the cause either of his daughter or of his grandson. Such, however, was not the intention of the coalition. As a general rule, the sovereigns personally were not at all hostile towards the emperor. They were influenced and even dominated by the ascendancy which England and the high aristocracy of Europe exercised on their cabinets and on the leaders of their armies. Napoleon used to say at St. Helena that democracy was violent, but that one could come to an understanding with it, that the aristocracy, on the other hand, was cold and implacable and never surrendered. Napoleon, having realized in 6 weeks all that will, energy of character, and superhuman activity could create in the way of resources, he could no longer put off his departure for the army. On January 23rd, 2 days before his departure, the emperor assembled the officers of the legions of the National Guard in the Tuileries Palace, and presenting the Empress and the King of Rome to them, he said, "I am going to fight this enemy. I entrust to you what I have dearest, the Empress my wife, and the King of Rome my son." He confirmed the Empress's regency with fresh letters patent and left on the 24th, after having embraced his wife and his son, whom he was never to see again. Before leaving this palace, which he quitted full of care and at the same time full of hope, Napoleon had the sorrow of hearing that Joachim Murat, the King of Naples, his brother-in-law, had declared himself in favor of the Allies in treaties signed with Austria and England, and was marching with a Neapolitan army against the French troops under the command of Prince Eugene. I will not speak at any length on the sad consequences which this fatal error had for Napoleon's political and military arrangements, although the war between Eugene and Murat was limited to an exchange of proclamations. My respect for the memory of the valiant and unfortunate King of Naples and the bitterness of my regrets invite me to keep silence. I know that King Joachim had a terrible struggle with himself before coming to so fatal a decision. He flattered himself that having taken this extreme step, he would be able to reserve himself the means of serving the emperor in the future. He was very far from thinking that this enterprise would lead him very shortly afterwards to the loss of his throne and of his life. On the morrow of Napoleon's departure to the army, a deputation of the National Guard with Marshal Moncey, Assistant Major General, who was commanding it in the Emperor's absence at its head, was presented to the Empress Regent by Cambyses. The Arch-Chancellor, Marshal Moncey, reached out an address in answer to the words which the Emperor had addressed to the officers of the National Guard, which we have quoted higher up. Very late on the same day, I had received the following letter from the Empress. I want you to come to me rather earlier tomorrow. There is nothing less to do than to write an answer to the speech of the National Guard. I hope that your advice will help me to make a fine speech, as I am totally lacking in ideas for the time being. I beg you to believe in all the sentiments with which I am your very affectionate Louise. I went to the Empress very early on the morrow, and under her eyes wrote the following answer to the deputation of the National Guard. Gentlemen, officers of the Guard, I am deeply touched by the sentiments which you have just expressed and am happy to have to transmit them to the emperor. In the midst of the anxieties and cares of every kind with which he is surrounded, his heart will be flattered with the new assurance of fidelity and devotion of which the National Guard of Paris has so often given him proofs. The emperor, in placing me and my son in your midst, fulfill a wish which was dear to me. My confidence in the good inhabitants of Paris is entire. The proofs of affection which I have received from them are pledges of what I may expect. Present circumstances would be very fitting to tighten the bonds which attach me to them. Had not our sentiments and our interests been made one long ago, were not my cause inseparable from those of all the French. Marie-Louise, who felt the necessity of winning the confidence and interest of the people of Paris in prevision of events which might bring the enemies to the gates of the capital, adopted this answer, but she was obliged to submit it to the approval of the Arch-Chancellor, who was the first counselor of the Regency. The Arch-Chancellor did not find it sufficiently dignified. It also seemed to him too personal. He contented himself with making the Empress say that she had shared the sentiments expressed by the Emperor in his speech to the National Guard, that like him, she had entire confidence in the courage, the devotion, and the fidelity of the officers of this guard, and that she would give orders that their address should be transmitted without delay to the Emperor. The Empress told him that she feared this answer might be found rather cold. The National Guard was full of such a spirit of patriotism that it never failed in its duty in the moment of danger. I have quoted this fact because it is a proof of the goodwill and the praiseworthy sentiments which at this time animated the Empress Marie-Louise. The territory was invaded. The emperor had marked the commencement of his immortal campaign in France with the glorious Battle of Brienne, but attacked afterwards by forces 3 times superior numbers. He had just lost the Battle of La Routière. It was feared in Paris that the enemy would be seen before our walls, and so great was the alarm that for a moment the question was discussed whether or not the great city should be evacuated. The emperor himself was troubled by the prospect of this danger and of the critical circumstances in which the Empress Regent's government and the cabinet of the empire might find themselves involved. Several letters were addressed by him from the army to his brother Joseph. As these letters are well known today and have appeared in various publications, we will only quote here those which seem to us of the most interest. On February 8th, the emperor wrote the following letter from Nogent to his brother. Nogent sur Seine, February 8th, 1814. My brother, hand this letter into the Empress Josephine's own hands. I write to her that she should write to Eugene. Tell her to send you the letter she writes and send it off at once by estafette. Your affectionate brother Napoleon. King Joseph answered the emperor on February 10th and informed him that the Empress Josephine's letter to Eugene had been sent off by estafette, and that this letter had been as pressing as it could be. This letter referred to the order given to Prince Eugene to march with his army to Geneva to join Marshal Augereau. If subsequent events, notably what was going on in Naples, had not obliged the emperor to renounce this movement, the consequences might have been most important. The entrance of Prince Eugene and his troops on French territory would indeed have given fresh and fruitful activity to the military operations which were so feebly directed by Augereau on this side. The imminence of the danger which was menacing Italy in consequence of the desertion of the King of Naples caused the emperor intense anxiety, and he wrote the following letter to King Joseph. Troyes, February 26th, 1814. My brother, it appears that the Allies have not yet ratified the King of Naples' treaty. I wish you to send one of your people to proceed with all haste to the king, that you should write to him in very plain-spoken manner on the iniquity of his conduct, offering to be his intermediary to bring him back again, and that this is the only thing that remains for him to do, or else his ruin is certain, either at the hands of France or the Allies. I need not remind you here all that you can say to him. The English themselves do not acknowledge him as king. It is not too late to save Italy and replace the viceroy on the Adige. Write also to the queen of her ingratitude, which nothing can justify and which disgusts even the allies. Write that as no battle has yet taken place between the French and Neapolitan troops, all can yet be arranged, but that there is not a moment to be lost. Senator Fouché is still in these cantons. You might write to him to deal with these matters with the person whom you will send. Signed, Napoleon.